They tried to evict the old woman from her cabin. Then the governor halted everything for Aunt Bea. The morning mist clung to the hollers of eastern Kentucky like a grandmother's shawl, soft and protective around the shoulders of the mountains. In a clearing where wild dogwood bloomed white against the green, stood a cabin that time seemed to have forgotten. Weathered cedar logs chinked with clay, a tin roof that sang with the rain, and a front porch that sagged just enough to show its age without surrendering its dignity. This was where Beatrice Miller, known to everyone in Pine Ridge as Aunt Bea, had lived for the past 63 years. At 84, she moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to listen to her body's whispers before they became shouts. Her silver hair, always pinned back in a neat bun, caught the early light as she scattered corn for her chickens, the same ritual she'd performed every dawn since 1962. The town of Pine Ridge, population 847, nestled in the valley below her mountain, perched like a handful of dice thrown by a gentle hand. Main Street boasted a post office, a general store, Millie's Diner, and not much else. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your business, but also where everyone would show up with casseroles if you needed them. To the folks in Pine Ridge, Aunt Bea was simply part of the landscape, as permanent and reliable as the mountains themselves. She grew the best tomatoes in 3 counties, made quilts that could warm you through the hardest winter, and had a way of appearing with a pot of soup whenever someone was hurting. Children who scraped their knees running wild through the woods knew they could always find a Band-Aid and a peppermint stick at her cabin door. But on this particular Tuesday in late September, 2 black SUVs wound their way up the narrow dirt road that led to Aunt Bea's sanctuary, carrying men in dark suits who had never learned the value of a front porch greeting or the art of mountain time. The lead vehicle came to a stop in a cloud of dust beside Aunt Bea's vegetable garden, where late-season beans climbed their poles like green prayers reaching toward heaven. The first man out was tall and pale, with the kind of soft hands that had never known honest work. His companion, shorter and rounder, clutched a leather briefcase as if it contained the secrets of the universe. "Mrs. Miller?" The tall man's voice carried the flat tones of somewhere far from these mountains. "I'm Robert Ashford from Morrison Development Corporation. This is my associate, Mr. Jenkins from the county assessor's office." Aunt Bea set down her watering can and turned to face them, her weathered hands smoothing her apron, a gesture as automatic as breathing. Her eyes, still sharp and blue as a winter sky, took their measure in the space of a heartbeat. "Morning, gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the honeyed cadence of Appalachian hills. "Y'all look like you've come a long way. Can I offer you some sweet tea? Coffee? It's going to be a warm day." Ashford cleared his throat uncomfortably. Acts of kindness weren't part of his usual business model. "Ma'am, we're here on official business. I'm afraid we have some documents that require your immediate attention." From his briefcase, Jenkins produced a manila folder thick with legal papers. "Mrs. Miller, the state has designated this area for the new Eastern Kentucky Commerce Corridor. Your property falls directly in the path of the planned highway expansion. We're prepared to offer you fair market value plus relocation assistance." Aunt Bea accepted the papers with steady hands, though she made no move to open them. Instead, she looked past the men to the mountains that had cradled her life for more than 8 decades. Mountains that had sheltered her marriage, witnessed the raising of her children, and absorbed her tears when those children moved away to chase dreams in bigger cities. "This land has been in my family since 1889, she said quietly. "My great-grandfather cleared these fields with his own hands. My husband and I built this cabin from trees we cut ourselves. Every board, every stone in that chimney, we placed them with love." "Mrs. Miller." Ashford's voice carried the practiced patience of someone accustomed to moving human obstacles. "I understand your attachment, but progress requires sacrifice. The highway will bring jobs to the region, economic opportunity. Surely you can see the greater good here." "The greater good," Aunt Bea repeated, the phrase tasting strange on her tongue. She walked to her porch rail and ran her hand along the smooth wood, worn silk-soft by decades of touch. "What about the good that's already here? What about the peace that folks find when they climb this mountain? What about the lessons these old trees have to teach?" Jenkins shuffled his feet impatiently. "Ma'am, with respect, You have 30 days to vacate the premises. If you're not out by then, the sheriff's department will have to assist with your removal. I'm sorry, but the law is the law." As the two men climbed back into their vehicles and disappeared down the mountain in another cloud of dust, Aunt Bea remained on her porch, the legal papers clutched in her hands like autumn leaves about to crumble. The chickens continued their eternal hunt for bugs in the yard, oblivious to the fact that their world had just shifted on its axis. Word traveled fast in Pine Ridge, the way it always does in small towns where news spreads through the coffee shop, the post office, and the party line faster than wildfire through dry timber. By afternoon, Aunt Bea's porch was crowded with neighbors, their faces painted with the same helpless anger that comes when good people face forces beyond their control. "It ain't right," declared Tom Whitaker, who ran the general store and had known Aunt Bea since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. "That woman has done more for this community than any 10 people I could name. They can't just come up here and push her around." Sarah Beth Coleman, who taught 3rd grade at Pine Ridge Elementary, clutched her coffee cup with white knuckles. "My grandmother always said Aunt Bea was special. Said she had stories that would make your hair curl, but she never would tell them. Always said the past was the past, and today was what mattered. Seems like today's what matters to them developers, too," muttered old Pete Hensley, his voice rough with the bitterness of someone who had watched too many good things disappear in the name of progress. But it was Aunt Bea herself who surprised them all. She emerged from her cabin carrying a tray loaded with fresh-baked cornbread and honey butter, her face serene as a Sunday morning. "Now don't y'all go working yourselves into a tizzy on my account," she said, settling into her favorite rocking chair. "The good Lord has carried me this far, and I reckon he's not fixing to drop me now. Young Danny Morrison, no relation to the development company, thank goodness, sat cross-legged at her feet like he had as a boy, when she'd told him stories about the Cherokee who once walked these mountains. At 17, he was all elbows and earnestness, with dreams of becoming a journalist that would take him far from these hills. "Aunt Bea," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "there's got to be something we can do. Some law or something. You can't just let them push you around." She reached down and ruffled his sandy hair, the same gesture she'd used to comfort him when he'd skinned his knees or broken his heart over some girl who didn't know he existed. "Sweet boy," she said softly. "Sometimes the hardest thing in life is knowing when to fight and when to let go. I've been blessed to live in this place, to love and be loved here. If it's time for me to move on, then I reckon that's what I'll do." But Danny Morrison had inherited more than just his grandfather's stubborn streak. He'd gotten his great-grandmother's nose for a story. Something in Aunt Bea's calm acceptance didn't sit right with him. In his experience, people who faced adversity with such grace usually had reserves of strength that ran deeper than anyone suspected. That evening, after the neighbors had gone home to their own worries and suppers, Danny found an excuse to return to the cabin. He discovered Aunt Bea sitting on her porch swing, a photo album open on her lap, her fingers tracing faces that existed now only in memory. "Mind if I sit a spell?" he asked, and she patted the swing beside her in invitation. In the growing twilight, fireflies began their ancient dance among the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called its lonely song. The photo album was old, its pages yellow with age and held together with love and careful handling. "These are beautiful pictures, Aunt Bea," Danny said, studying a black and white photograph of a young woman in a nurse's uniform, her smile radiant despite the weariness in her eyes. "Is this you?" "Long time ago," she said, her voice soft with memory. 1943. I was 22 and thought I knew everything there was to know about the world." Danny turned the page and found more photographs, groups of nurses, hospitals, and then something that made his breath catch. A photograph of the same young woman, now wearing a different kind of uniform, standing beside a jeep with a red cross painted on its side. "You were in the war," he said, not quite a question. "Korea," she said simply. 1951 to 1953. I was a combat medic with the 8063rd Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. We called it a MASH unit. The words hung in the evening air like smoke from a campfire, heavy with implication. Danny had grown up hearing stories about Korea from his grandfather, Stories about a forgotten war fought in impossible conditions by heroes who came home to a country that barely acknowledged their sacrifice. I never knew, he whispered. Not many folks do, Aunt Bea replied, turning another page to reveal a photograph that stopped Danny's heart. It showed a group of wounded soldiers, and in the center, the young woman who would become Aunt Bea knelt beside a stretcher, her hands gentle on a boy's forehead. The boy couldn't have been much older than Danny himself, his face pale with pain and youth. We saved a lot of boys over there, she said quietly. Lost some too. That's the hardest part of loving people. Sometimes you can't save them all, no matter how hard you try. Danny found his voice, though it came out smaller than he intended. Were you decorated? Did you get medals? Aunt Bea's smile was sad and proud at the same time. 3 Purple Hearts, got wounded myself more than once. Bronze Star with V for valor, and... She paused, her fingers finding a photograph. Tucked deep in the back of the album, the Distinguished Service Cross. The photograph showed President Eisenhower himself pinning a medal to the chest of a young woman in dress uniform, her face solemn with the weight of honor and sacrifice. The Distinguished Service Cross, Danny breathed. He knew enough military history to understand that this was the second highest decoration for valor in the United States Army, awarded only for extraordinary heroism in combat. What did you do? He asked. Aunt Bea was quiet for so long that Danny thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of memory and the measured cadence of someone who had told this story only rarely, and only to those who needed to hear it. There was a place called Pork Chop Hill, she began. April 1953. The Chinese had overrun one of our forward positions, and there were wounded boys trapped in a bunker cut off from any hope of rescue. Command said it was too dangerous. We'd already lost 2 medics trying to reach them. She turned the photograph over and Danny saw writing in faded ink. For Sergeant Beatrice Miller, who ran toward hell to bring angels home. Colonel James Morrison, 8063rd MASH. I couldn't leave them, she continued. One of those boys reminded me of my little brother back home. So I took a stretcher and crawled through 300 yards of enemy fire, through mud and worse things than mud, while mortars fell like rain. Found 6 boys in that bunker, 3 of them hurt bad enough to die if they didn't get help soon. Danny realized he was holding his breath. Took me 4 trips, Aunt Bea said. 4 trips crawling through hell with boys on my back, dodging bullets, and praying to God I'd make it long enough to save just one more. The last boy I carried out, he was the one who looked like my brother. Took a piece of shrapnel in his chest just as I got him to safety. He died in my arms calling for his mama. Tears ran down her weathered cheeks, but her voice remained steady. That's when I learned the hardest truth about heroism. Sometimes, you do everything right and you still lose what matters most. But you saved 5 lives, Danny said. Yes. She nodded. I saved 5 lives. And those 5 boys went home to their families, went on to have children and grandchildren, to live and love and matter in this world. That's what I carry with me. Not the one I lost, but the 5 I brought home. Danny sat in stunned silence as the weight of revelation settled around them like dusk. This woman, this gentle, humble woman who made the best cornbread in 3 counties and never raised her voice even when she was angry, had crawled through enemy fire to save wounded soldiers. She was a genuine American hero and no one knew. Aunt Bea, he said finally, why don't people know about this? Why haven't you ever told anyone? She closed the photo album gently, her hands caressing its worn cover. When I came home from Korea, I was different. The war had changed me in ways I couldn't explain to folks who hadn't been there. I met my Harold at a church social in 1955. He was the kindest man who ever drew breath, and he loved me without needing to know all the dark places I'd been. She looked out over the mountains where the last light of day painted the ridges in shades of gold and purple. Harold and I, we built a good life here. We raised 2 children, saw them grow up and move away to follow their own dreams. We helped our neighbors, loved our community, and found peace in the simple act of living each day with gratitude. The war was part of me, but it wasn't all of me. I didn't need the world to know about my medals to know who I was. But now they want to. Take all this away, Danny said, anger rising in his voice. They want to tear down your home, your history, everything you and Harold built together. Maybe, Aunt Bea said simply. Or maybe the good Lord has other plans. That night, Danny Morrison sat at his computer until dawn, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he crafted the most important article he'd ever written. He researched the 8063rd MASH unit, cross-referenced military records, and verified every detail of Aunt Bea's story until he had built an unshakable foundation of truth. Morning. He had crafted a story that would change everything, but he was just a high school student writing for the Pine Ridge Gazette, a weekly paper with a circulation of maybe 300 souls. He needed a bigger platform, a voice that could reach beyond these mountains. That's when he remembered his cousin Maria, who worked as a researcher for Governor Patricia Hayes in Frankfurt. Maria had always encouraged his writing, had told him that someday his words would matter to the world. Maybe someday had arrived. The phone call that would change. Everything came at 7:30 in the morning, just as Governor Hayes was reviewing her schedule for the day. Maria Coleman, formerly Maria Morrison before she'd married and moved to the Capitol, spoke with the urgency of someone who understood that history sometimes turned on the smallest hinges. Governor Hayes, she said, I need 5 minutes of your time. My cousin just sent me a story about a woman in Pike County who's about to be evicted to make way for the Commerce Corridor project. Ma'am, this woman is a Korean War hero, Distinguished Service Cross recipient, and nobody knows. Governor Hayes, who had built her political career on the foundation of honoring Kentucky's veterans, felt something cold settle in her stomach. Tell me everything, she said. 30 minutes later, the governor's chief of staff was making urgent phone calls, and by noon, a convoy of state vehicles was winding its way through the mountains toward Pine Ridge. But Governor Hayes had made one call herself, to the Pentagon's Veterans Affairs Liaison, where a computer search quickly confirmed what Maria had told her. Sergeant Beatrice Miller, U.S. Army Medical Corps, Korean War veteran. Distinguished Service Cross, Bronze Star with V device, 3 Purple Hearts. One of only 7 women to receive the DSC during the Korean conflict. Listed as residing in Pine Ridge, Kentucky, but no contact with VA services since 1962. The governor stared at the computer screen, reading the citation that accompanied Aunt Bea's Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy near Porkchop Hill, Korea, on 16 April 1953. Sergeant Miller voluntarily exposed herself to intense enemy fire to rescue 6 wounded soldiers from an advanced position overrun by Chinese forces. Despite being wounded herself, Sergeant Miller made 4 separate trips through a gauntlet of enemy fire, successfully evacuating 5 soldiers to safety. Her actions were in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon herself, her unit, and the United States Army. Cancel my afternoon appointments, Governor Hayes told her chief of staff. I'm going to Pike County. Meanwhile, back in Pine Ridge, Aunt Bea was spending what she thought might be her last morning in her garden. The legal papers sat on her kitchen table, still unread, while she tended to her late-season tomatoes and spoke quietly to the flowers that Harold had planted 30 years ago. She was kneeling beside her rose bush, Harold's favorite, a climbing variety that covered half the porch each summer with blooms the color of sunrise, when she heard the sound of vehicles coming up the mountain road. For a moment her heart sank, thinking that the developers had returned with the sheriff to force her departure. But these weren't the black SUVs of corporate power. Instead, a convoy of official state vehicles wound their way up the narrow road, followed by what looked like half the news media in Kentucky. Camera crews, reporters, and official-looking people in suits stepped carefully through her yard, treating her simple homestead with the reverence usually reserved for hallowed ground. And then, stepping out of the lead vehicle with the dignity and presence that had made her one of Kentucky's most beloved governors, came Patricia Hayes herself. She was a woman in her early 60s, silver-haired and strong-featured, with the kind of eyes that had seen enough of life to understand what truly mattered. Aunt Bea rose slowly from her garden, brushing dirt from her hands and smoothing her apron in the automatic gesture of mountain hospitality. She had no idea who these people were or why they had come, but her mother had raised her to treat all visitors with respect and kindness. "Ma'am," Governor Hayes said, approaching with the careful reverence of someone entering a sacred space. "Are you Beatrice Miller?" "Yes, I am," Aunt Bea replied, confusion clear in her voice. "I'm sorry, but I don't believe we've met." "My name is Patricia Hayes," the governor said, and something in her tone made Aunt Bea straighten slightly. "I'm the governor of Kentucky, and I've come here to personally apologize to you, and to make sure that a terrible mistake is corrected." The words hung in the mountain air like morning mist, impossible to grasp and yet unmistakably real. Aunt Bea blinked, certain she had misheard. "Governor?" she repeated. "Ma'am, I've just learned about your service to our country during the Korean War. I've seen your military records, read the citation for your Distinguished Service Cross. Sergeant Miller, it is an honor to meet you." And then something unprecedented happened. The governor of Kentucky stepped forward and saluted, a crisp military salute offered with the deepest respect to a fellow veteran who had earned it in the crucible of combat. The moment stretched between them, heavy with meaning and recognition too long delayed. Aunt Bea, instinctively, returned the salute, her weathered hand moving to her forehead with the muscle memory of someone who had once worn the uniform with pride. "At ease, Sergeant," Governor Hayes said gently, and both women relaxed. "I don't understand," Aunt Bea said, her voice smaller than usual. "Why are you here? How did you—" "A young man named Danny Morrison wrote an article about you," the governor explained. "He contacted my office through his cousin, who works for the state. When we learned that the Commerce Corridor project was threatening to displace a Distinguished Service Cross recipient, one of Kentucky's greatest heroes, I knew I had to come personally." Behind the governor, news cameras rolled and reporters scribbled notes, but the circus of media attention seemed to fade into background noise as the two women faced each other across the garden where Harold's roses still bloomed. "Ma'am," Governor Hayes continued, "I want you to know that as of this moment, all eviction proceedings against your property have been halted indefinitely. Furthermore, I am immediately declaring this property and the surrounding 50 acres, a Kentucky State Historical Landmark, to be preserved in perpetuity as a monument to the service and sacrifice of our veterans." Aunt Bea felt her knees go weak and she reached out to steady herself against her porch rail. I don't know what to say." "There's more," the governor said gently. "The state of Kentucky owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid, but we can begin by ensuring that your story is told, that your service is honored, and that your home remains yours for as long as you want it." From the crowd of officials stepped a man in military dress uniform, his chest decorated with ribbons and stars that spoke of a career spent in service to his country. He was younger than Aunt Bea, but carried himself with the bearing of someone who understood the weight of command and the cost of honor. "Sergeant Miller," he said, stepping forward. "I'm Colonel Robert Chen, Director of Veterans Affairs for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. On behalf of a grateful state and nation, I want to present you with something that's long overdue." From a wooden box, he removed a folded American flag, one that had flown over the Kentucky State Capitol, and a certificate of commendation signed by the governor herself. "This flag flew over our state capitol yesterday in honor of your service," Colonel Chen said, his voice thick with emotion. "The certificate designates you as a Kentucky colonel, the highest honor our state can bestow upon a civilian. But it was what happened next that would be remembered by everyone present as the moment when the full weight of recognition finally found its mark." From the crowd stepped 5 elderly men, their steps careful but determined, their faces marked by the passage of decades but unmistakably strong. The first man, leaning heavily on a walking stick but moving with purpose, stopped directly in front of Aunt Bea. His eyes, faded blue behind wire-rimmed glasses, filled with tears as he looked into her face. "Sergeant Miller," he said, his voice cracking with emotion, "do you remember me? Private Tony Kowalski, 2nd Infantry Division, Pork Chop Hill, April 16, 1953. The years seemed to fall away from Aunt Bea's face as recognition dawned. Her hand flew to her mouth and tears began to flow down her cheeks. "Tony?" she whispered. "Little Tony from Chicago?" "Not so little anymore," he said, laughing through his tears. "But I'm here because of you. We're all here because of you." One by one, the other 4 men introduced themselves, names that Aunt Bea remembered from letters written home to worried mothers. faces she had last seen pale with pain and youth on stretchers in a field hospital half a world away. "We've been looking for you for 70 years, said James Patterson, who had been 18 when Aunt Bea carried him to safety. "When we heard on the news what was happening, we had to come. We had to thank you. You saved our lives," added Michael Rodriguez, now a grandfather himself but still carrying the gratitude of the scared boy he'd been in Korea. "You gave us the chance to come home, to have families, to live. Everything good in our lives started with your courage." The reunion played out on Aunt Bea's front porch while cameras captured every moment for a nation that had forgotten about the Korean War, but would remember it now through the story of one woman's extraordinary heroism. The 5 men she had saved had gone on to live remarkable lives, teachers and engineers, fathers and grandfathers, pillars of their communities, and each of them carried her gift forward through generations of children who existed because Sergeant Beatrice Miller had refused to leave wounded soldiers behind. As the sun began to set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the formal ceremonies gave way to something more intimate. The officials and media gradually departed, but the 5 veterans remained, sitting on Aunt Bea's porch as she served them sweet tea and cornbread, sharing stories and memories that bridged 7 decades. "You know," said Tony Kowalski, "we used to talk about you in the hospital. After you got us out, after we were safe, we'd talk about the angel who crawled through hell to bring us home. We promised each other that someday we'd find you and thank you properly." "Took us long enough," added James Patterson with a rueful smile. Aunt Bea looked at these men, her boys, she still thought of them, and felt a peace settle over her that she hadn't experienced since Harold's death 3 years earlier. For so long she had wondered if the sacrifice and trauma of war had been worth the cost. Now, looking at the lives that had grown from the seeds of that terrible day on Porkchop Hill, she finally had her answer. "I need to tell you boys something," she said quietly. "For 70 years I've carried the weight of the one I couldn't save. Jimmy Martinez from El Paso. He died in my arms just as we reached safety. I've wondered every day if I could have moved faster, been stronger, done something different." "Sergeant," Tony said gently, "Jimmy was my bunkmate. I held his hand when he died. He wasn't afraid because you were there with him. You gave him the gift of not dying alone." The words hung in the evening air like a benediction, and Aunt Bea felt a weight she had carried for 7 decades finally lift from her shoulders. "Besides," added Michael Rodriguez, "Jimmy would have kicked our butts if we'd spent 70 years moping around instead of living the lives you gave us. He'd want us to celebrate what we got, not mourn what we lost." As the stars began to appear over the Kentucky mountains, 5 old soldiers said goodbye to the woman who had saved their lives, but this time it wasn't goodbye forever. They had found each other again, and they wouldn't lose touch a second time. After they left, Aunt Bea sat alone on her porch swing, surrounded by the quiet sounds of her mountain home. In the distance, she could hear the whippoorwills calling, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl asked its eternal question of the night. The legal papers still sat on her kitchen table, but they seemed less threatening now, less important. Tomorrow would bring reporters and officials, historians who wanted to record her story, and visitors who came to see the place where a hero lived. Her quiet life was about to become much less quiet. But tonight, she was simply Beatrice Miller, sitting on the porch of the cabin she had built with Harold, watching fireflies dance among the trees they had planted together. Tonight, she was home, and home was safe. The next morning brought Danny Morrison, who arrived early with his notebook and camera, ready to document the aftermath of the previous day's remarkable events. He found Aunt Bea in her garden, tending to her tomatoes as if nothing had changed. "Morning, Aunt Bea," he said, settling cross-legged beside her as he had done so many times before. "How are you feeling about everything?" She looked up from her plants, her eyes bright with something that might have been amusement. "Well," she said, "I reckon I'm about to learn what it's like to be famous. Can't say I'm looking forward to all the fuss. But if it helps people remember the boys who didn't come home from Korea, then I suppose it's worth it." "The governor says they're going to build a memorial here," Danny said. A Korean War memorial garden right here on your property. Visitors will come from all over the country. Aunt Bea nodded thoughtfully. That's fitting, I suppose. This land has always been about growing things, vegetables and flowers, love, and memories. Adding some history to the mix won't hurt anything. She paused in her work and looked at the young man who had changed her life with a phone call and a story. Danny, she said, I want you to know how proud I am of you. You could have let those developers push me around and minded your own business. Instead, you chose to dig deeper, to care about the truth. That's what good reporters do. They shine light in dark places and give voice to people who need to be heard. I just wrote what was true, Danny said, blushing slightly. That's all any of us can do, Aunt Bea replied. Tell the truth, treat people with kindness, and try to leave the world a little better than we found it. As if summoned by their conversation, another car appeared on the mountain road. Not an official vehicle this time, but a modest sedan that looked like it had seen better days. From it emerged a woman in her 50s, her graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her clothes practical rather than fashionable. Excuse me, she called as she approached. Are you Beatrice Miller? I am, Aunt Bea replied, rising to greet her visitor. My name is Susan Martinez, the woman said, and something in her voice made both Aunt Bea and Danny pay close attention. My grandfather was Jimmy Martinez, from El Paso. He was the soldier who died in your arms at Porkchop Hill. The words hit Aunt Bea like a physical blow, and she reached out to steady herself against the garden fence. Jimmy? She whispered. I've been looking for you for 20 years. Susan continued, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. Ever since, my father died and left me my grandfather's Purple Heart and his letters home. In one of them, he wrote about a nurse who tried to save him, who held him when he was dying. He wrote that she had kind eyes and a gentle voice and that she promised him he wouldn't die alone. Aunt Bea felt her own tears starting to fall. He kept that promise, Susan said. In his last letter, the one he dictated to another soldier. Before Porkchop Hill, he wrote about the nurse who called him Mijo, little son, the way his grandmother used to. He said he wasn't afraid to die because an angel was watching over him. I remember, Aunt Bea whispered. He had a picture of his sweetheart in his pocket. Maria, I think her name was. He made me promise to tell her that he loved her. My grandmother, Susan nodded. She never remarried. She said Jimmy was the love of her life and she'd wait for him in heaven. She died last year, at 93, still wearing his ring. The two women stood in the garden where life grew from the earth in endless cycles of renewal, connected across the decades by the memory of a young soldier who had died far from home, but not alone. I wanted you to know, Susan continued, that Jimmy's death wasn't in vain. My grandmother raised my father with stories about Jimmy's courage, his kindness, his dreams of coming home to build a family. Even though Jimmy died, his love lived on. My father became a teacher because Jimmy had wanted to teach children. My father named his son, my brother James, after the grandfather he never met. She reached into her purse and withdrew a small worn photograph, the same one that Jimmy had carried in his pocket 70 years ago. I want you to have this, she said, pressing the photo into Aunt Bea's hands. You were with him at the end. You should have the picture he died looking at. Aunt Bea looked down at the faded image of a young woman with dark hair and bright eyes, Maria Martinez, who had loved a soldier boy from El Paso and had kept faith with that love for 7 decades. Thank you, she whispered, clutching the photograph to her heart. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for letting me know that he was loved, that he was remembered. As Susan Martinez drove away, promising to return with more family members who wanted to meet the woman who had been with their grandfather at the end, Aunt Bea and Danny sat together on the porch swing, watching the mountains catch the morning light. It's remarkable, Danny said quietly. All these connections, all these lives touched by what you did 70 years ago. It's like ripples spreading across a pond. That's the thing about love, Aunt Bea replied, still holding Jimmy's photograph. It doesn't die with the person who gave it. It keeps moving through the world, touching new lives, creating new connections. Every act of kindness, every moment of courage, they echo forward through time. The weeks that followed brought a parade of visitors to the little cabin on the mountain. Veterans from all America's wars came to pay their respects to one of their own. Historians arrived to record Aunt Bea's stories for the National Archives. The families of the soldiers she had saved in Korea made pilgrimages to meet the woman who had given them their fathers and grandfathers. The governor kept her word. The eviction was permanently canceled, and the Commerce Corridor was rerouted to avoid not just Aunt Bea's property, but the entire mountain, which was designated as the Sergeant Beatrice Miller Veterans Memorial Preserve. A small museum was built at the base of the mountain, telling the story of the Korean War and honoring all who served. But the centerpiece was always the story of the nurse who crawled through hell to bring angels home. But perhaps the most meaningful change came in the form of a program that Aunt Bea herself suggested. Working with the state's Department of Veterans Affairs, she established the Angel Corps, a network of volunteers who sought out forgotten veterans, making sure they received the care and recognition they deserved. The program's motto, inscribed on a bronze plaque beside Aunt Bea's front door, read simply, "No one left behind." Young Danny Morrison, whose curiosity and courage had started it all, received a full scholarship to the University of Kentucky's journalism program. But every summer he returned to Pine Ridge to help Aunt Bea tend her garden and to learn the lessons that couldn't be taught in any classroom. Lessons about integrity, compassion, and the quiet heroism that lived in ordinary people. On the first anniversary of what the local newspaper had dubbed the day the governor came to call, Pine Ridge held its first annual Veterans Day celebration. The entire town turned out, along with visitors from across the country to honor not just Aunt Bea, but all those who had served. The ceremony was held in Aunt Bea's front yard, beneath the spreading oak tree that Harold had planted on their wedding day. She sat in her favorite rocking chair, wearing a simple blue dress and the Distinguished Service Cross that she had finally agreed to display, not for her own glory, but as a symbol of all who had served and sacrificed. Governor Hayes returned, for the occasion, bringing with her a surprise that left Aunt Bea speechless. From a military transport vehicle emerged 12 elderly veterans, all former patients of the 8063rd MASH unit, men whose lives had been saved not by Aunt Bea's dramatic rescue at Porkchop Hill, but by her steady, skilled hands during the long months of war. "We couldn't let this day pass without coming to thank you," said Robert Chen, not the colonel from Veterans Affairs, but a different Robert Chen, a former private who had spent 3 weeks recovering in the MASH unit after taking shrapnel at Old Baldy. "You probably don't remember us individually, but you saved each of our lives in your own way." "I remember every face that came through our tent," Aunt Bea said softly. "Every boy who called for his mother, everyone who was brave when he was scared, everyone who made it home and everyone who didn't. You carry them all with you." As the ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse, Aunt Bea found herself alone on her porch with the 5 men from Porkchop Hill, who had become not just survivors connected by shared trauma, but genuine friends who visited regularly and called weekly. "You know what the strangest part of all this is?" said Tony Kowalski, settling into the porch swing beside her. "What's that?" Aunt Bea asked. "For 70 years, we've been calling you our angel, our hero. But I think we had it backwards. We were your angels. We were the gift you needed to understand that your life had meaning, that your sacrifices mattered." Aunt Bea looked out over the mountains that had sheltered her life, now protected forever by the designation that bore her name. In the distance, she could see the lights of Pine Ridge twinkling in the valley, each one representing a life, a story, a connection in the great web of human experience. "Maybe that's how it works," she said thoughtfully. "Maybe we're all angels for each other in our turn. Maybe the secret isn't being perfect or being famous. Maybe it's just showing up when we're needed and doing what we can with what we have." As the stars appeared overhead, the same stars that had watched over a young nurse crawling through enemy fire 7 decades ago, Aunt Bea Miller, Sergeant Beatrice Miller, Distinguished Service Cross recipient, Kentucky colonel, and quiet legend, rocked gently on her porch swing, surrounded by the profound peace that comes from a life lived with purpose and love. The developer's papers still sat in a drawer in her kitchen, but they would never be needed now. This land, this home, this life built on the foundation of service and sacrifice would endure. The cabin that she and Harold had built with their own hands would stand as a testament to the truth that heroism isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's as quiet as a neighbor bringing soup to the sick, as gentle as a hand holding another through darkness, as simple as refusing to leave someone behind. And in the years that followed, as visitors from around the world came to visit the Sergeant Beatrice Miller Veterans Memorial Preserve, they would find more than just a museum or a monument. They would find a living reminder that extraordinary courage often wears ordinary clothes, that heroes walk among us unrecognized until the moment when their true nature is revealed. Some came seeking inspiration for their own struggles. Others came to understand what service really meant. Many came simply to sit on Aunt Bea's porch and listen to her stories, to learn from someone who had faced the worst that humanity could offer and had chosen to respond with love. And Aunt Bea welcomed them all, just as she had always welcomed visitors to her mountain home. She served sweet tea and cornbread, shared her garden's bounty, and offered the gift that had always been her greatest strength, the ability to see the dignity and worth in every person who crossed her path. The young soldiers who visited were often surprised to find that this legendary figure looked like their own grandmothers, kind, weathered, and wise. The older veterans wept openly as they shook her hand, understanding in a way that younger people couldn't, the magnitude of what she had done and the price she had paid for it. Children who came with their families left with an understanding that heroes weren't just characters in movies or comic books. They were real people who made hard choices in impossible circumstances, who carried their scars with dignity, and who found ways to keep serving long after their official duty was done. And through it all, Aunt Bea maintained the same quiet grace that had carried her through 8 decades of life. She never sought the spotlight, though it found her anyway. She never claimed to be special, though everyone who met her knew they were in the presence of someone extraordinary. On quiet evenings when the last visitor had gone home and the mountains settled into their ancient rhythm of peace, she would sit on her porch swing and think about Harold, about the boys she had saved and the one she couldn't, about the strange and wonderful path that had led her from the battlefields of Korea to this moment of recognition and honor. Sometimes she would pull out the old photo album and trace the faces of the young nurse she had been, marveling at the journey that had brought her to this place of hard-won wisdom and contentment. Other times she would simply rock and listen to the night sounds of her mountain home, the whippoorwills and owls, the rustle of wind through Harold's trees, the distant sound of the creek that had sung the same song for centuries. And in those moments of perfect quiet, Beatrice Miller understood the greatest truth of all, that a life measured not in fame or fortune but in love given and received, in service offered and sacrifices made, in quiet moments of kindness that ripple forward through time. Such a life is rich beyond measure. The cabin would stand, the mountain would endure, and the story would be told for generations to come. But the real monument to Sergeant Beatrice Miller wasn't built of stone or bronze. It lived in the hearts of those she had saved, in the children and grandchildren who existed because she had refused to leave anyone behind, in the countless lives touched by her example of quiet heroism. And on clear nights, when the stars shone bright over the Kentucky mountains, visitors to the memorial preserve could still see a light in the window of the little cabin, and know that somewhere in those hills, an angel was keeping watch, not flying overhead with wings of white, but sitting on a front porch swing, ready to offer sweet tea and wisdom to anyone who needed either. The eviction notice had been torn up long ago, but its legacy lived on in a different way, as the catalyst that had finally brought recognition to a woman who had never sought it, who had lived her heroism quietly for 70 years until the world was ready to understand what true service looked like. They had tried to evict the old woman from her cabin. Instead, they had given the world back one of its greatest heroes, and in doing so had reminded everyone that the most extraordinary lives are often hidden in the most ordinary places, waiting for the right moment to reveal their light. Aunt Bea's story reminds us that true greatness often lives quietly among us, until the world finally catches up. Her courage on a Korean hillside 70 years ago created ripples that touched countless lives, but it was her daily choice to live with kindness and grace that made her truly heroic. What did you find most moving about her story? Was it her battlefield heroism, her humble acceptance of recognition, or the way she continued serving others throughout her life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you've ever witnessed an unsung hero get the recognition they deserve, or if you know a veteran whose story needs to be told, we'd love to hear about it. These stories matter. They remind us that heroes walk among us every day, often unrecognized until someone takes the time to really see them. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of quiet courage and hidden heroes. Hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Thank you for watching, and remember, you never know when you might be sitting next to a hero who's simply waiting for someone to ask about their story.